It begins quietly. Imagine a slow-moving river in upstate New York, the early morning fog resting gently over the surface. The year is 1817. The young United States is barely 4 decades old, and the idea of connecting the Atlantic Ocean to the Great Lakes sounds almost like madness. At that time, New York City was just beginning to grow into a port of global significance. Yet the inland states, Ohio, Michigan, and beyond, were still considered faraway territories, cut off by forests, mountains, and muddy, impassable roads. But there was one dream. A line of water, a man-made river, stretching more than 300 miles through wilderness and farmland, linking the Hudson River at Albany to Lake Erie at Buffalo. It was called the Erie Canal, though at the beginning, most people just called it Clinton's Ditch, after the governor who dared to believe it could be built. Governor DeWitt Clinton was a man obsessed with progress. In an age when America's greatest engineering achievements involved wooden bridges and dirt roads, Clinton envisioned a channel deep enough for boats to carry tons of goods and passengers. Critics called it foolish. Newspapers mocked it as a canal to nowhere. Some even said it would bankrupt New York State. But Clinton persisted. He believed that if the canal were completed, it would transform the nation, and in a way, he was right. The first shovels broke ground in the summer of 1817 near Rome, New York. There were no modern machines, no steam-powered excavators. Everything was done by hand. Immigrant laborers, many of them Irish, dug through clay, rock, and swamp, sometimes waist-deep in water. They fought off mosquitoes, disease, and the brutal heat of summer. The pay was low, the hours long, yet they kept digging. Over the next 8 years, more than 80 locks, 18 aqueducts, and hundreds of miles of channel were built. Towns began to spring up along the route. Syracuse, Rochester, Utica, places that would soon become the beating heart of upstate New York. Farmers who had once struggled to get their crops to market suddenly saw hope. They could now send wheat, lumber, and livestock east to New York City in a matter of days, not weeks. When the canal finally opened in 1825, it was nothing short of a miracle. A parade of boats made the first ceremonial journey from Buffalo to Albany, carrying barrels of water from Lake Erie to pour into the Atlantic. A symbolic wedding of the waters. Church bells rang in every town along the way. Newspapers across the country celebrated what they called the greatest work of internal improvement in America. And indeed it was. Within a few years, the Erie Canal slashed the cost of shipping goods by more than 90%. Land values along its route skyrocketed. Immigrants poured into the region, drawn by new jobs and the promise of opportunity. New York City became the country's busiest port, eclipsing Philadelphia and Boston. The canal had effectively tied the interior of the nation to the Atlantic world. But beyond the triumph and celebration, there was also silence, the quiet persistence of laborers whose names were never recorded. Men who died from fever and accidents were buried beside the canal, their graves unmarked, their stories untold. Women, too, endured the hardships of canal life, running taverns and boarding houses for the endless stream of travelers. Children would watch the boats glide by, dreaming of a better life somewhere beyond the horizon. In those early decades, the Erie Canal was more than a waterway. It was a living artery. Packet boats carried not only freight but also people. Settlers heading westward, preachers spreading faith, merchants seeking fortune. On warm summer evenings, passengers would gather on the decks, listening to the gentle splash of water against the hull, watching lanterns reflect on the canal's surface like stars scattered across a quiet ribbon of night. There was rhythm in its movement, almost musical. The sound of mules' hooves on the towpath, the creak of rope and wood, the distant call of a lock tender signaling a boat through. For a nation still defining itself, the Erie Canal represented more than commerce. It was a symbol of what America wanted to be, connected, industrious, and full of possibility. Yet progress has a way of moving faster than anyone expects. By the mid-1800s, the railroad had arrived. Steel tracks began to snake across the same fields the canal once dominated. Trains could travel faster, farther, and in any season. While canal boats were still reliable and cheap, they began to seem old-fashioned, relics of an earlier time. Still, the canal persisted. It was enlarged, modernized, made deeper and wider. But its glory years were fading, even as it continued to serve the towns that had grown up around it. And yet, for a generation or two, life along the canal remained slow and steady, a world of its own. You could wake before dawn in a lockkeeper's cabin, hear the sound of water rushing in as the gates opened. The air would be thick with the smell of damp earth and rope. Mules would stamp their hooves impatiently, their drivers shouting softly to them, "Giddy up." Drul, a phrase that would one day become a line in a famous folk song. Travelers spoke of how the canal seemed to change people. It brought strangers together, farmers, merchants, immigrants, people who might never have met otherwise. On its banks, small towns learned to trade, talk, and trust one another. The canal taught cooperation in an age of rugged independence. At night, when everything grew still, one could almost hear the past echoing through the locks, the voices of the diggers, the laughter of children, the creak of a boat's rope against the wooden posts. The water carried memories as surely as it carried cargo. The Erie Canal was, in many ways, America's first great infrastructure project, a testament to the belief that ordinary people could do extraordinary things. And for decades, it worked exactly as intended. It turned New York into the Empire State. It made Western expansion possible. It fed cities, powered mills, and shaped communities. But like all great achievements, its moment eventually passed. By the early 20th century, the canal that once carried half of America's trade had grown quiet. The railroads had taken over. Highways followed. The locks began to rust. The towpaths turned to trails. And yet, even in its decline, the canal remained hauntingly beautiful. If you were to walk beside it today, you might see the water still, reflecting the trees that lean over it. You might hear nothing but the faint rustle of wind through reeds, and you might imagine just for a moment the world it once connected, a nation young and ambitious, a people full of impossible dreams. There is something deeply American about that kind of silence. It is not the silence of failure, but of endurance, the kind that lingers long after the crowds have gone home. The Erie Canal didn't just move goods, it moved imagination. It showed a restless country what it could build and how far it could reach, if it only believed in itself. In a way, the canal never really disappeared. Its path remains etched into the geography of New York, into the memory of every town it touched. Some parts have been restored, others left to nature. Cyclists and hikers now follow the old towpaths, unaware that beneath their feet lies the same ground where thousands once labored. In the quiet ripples of the water, you can still hear faint traces of voices, as if the canal itself remembers. The Erie Canal began as a dream of connection, a bold, improbable idea drawn on a map. It became the backbone of a young nation, and though time has moved on, the water still flows, calm and patient, whispering stories of a past that refuses to be forgotten. It is, perhaps, the most boring kind of history. No battles. No kings, no heroes in shining armor. Just people, dirt, water, and willpower. But maybe that's what makes it beautiful. Because in its stillness, it tells us something about who we are. And how every great change begins not with noise, but with a quiet idea, carried forward one shovelful at a time. When the Erie Canal entered its middle age, something strange happened. It stopped being just a waterway and began to feel like a living community stretched across hundreds of miles. The boats that once carried wheat and timber now also carried laughter, stories, and even entire families. The canal towns had grown. Places that were once no more than muddy camps had become thriving small cities with brick warehouses, mills and taverns glowing with lamplight. By the 1840s and 1850s, life along the canal was full of motion yet strangely calm. You could walk into a canal-side town at dusk and smell the mixture of wood smoke, molasses, and horses. The faint sound of a fiddle might drift from a tavern where travelers gathered to share the day's tales. Everyone along the canal knew the rhythm. The steady arrival and departure of boats, the rise and fall of water in the locks, the distant clinking of iron chains against stone. The canal workers had their own slang, their own humor, their own music. They called themselves canalers. Some were rough, others kind. They knew how to handle mules better than most people could handle machines. Life aboard a canal boat was cramped. Families slept in narrow bunks. cooked in small stoves and spent their days moving at a pace just a bit faster than a walk. Yet there was something deeply human in that slowness. Children who grew up on canal boats often never stayed in one town long enough to attend school. They learned by watching, how to tie ropes, how to judge the depth of water by its color, how to read weather by the scent of the air. Their memories were made not of buildings or neighborhoods, but of the endless horizon of water and sky. For them, home was wherever the boat tied up at night. In those years, the Erie Canal was a thread that stitched the Northeast together. It was not glamorous, but it was dependable. Farmers depended on it to carry their grain east. Merchants depended on it to bring goods west. Immigrants depended on it to move inland, where land was cheaper and dreams seemed closer. For many, the canal represented a promise that progress could be made one lock at a time, without rush, without spectacle. But the canal also had a darker side. The work was still dangerous. Locks could break. Boats could sink. In winter, when the canal froze, entire towns would fall silent. Men without work waited for the thaw, while children skated on the frozen surface, their laughter echoing through the icy air. Some winters were cruel, others merciful. But always, spring brought the water back, and with it, life. In the evenings, when the day's work was done, families would gather by the towpath fires. Someone would play a harmonica. Someone else would tell stories of the old days, when the canal was new, and the first boats made the journey from Buffalo to Albany. The young would listen, not fully understanding that they were living in the middle of a fading golden age. By the late 19th century, railroads had spread like veins of iron across the landscape. The great steam locomotives cut through hills and plains with ease. They didn't freeze in winter, didn't wait for locks, didn't rely on the steady pull of mules. The canal was still in use, but less and less each year. For the people who had built their lives around it, this change felt like a slow unraveling, not sudden, but inevitable. Still, the canal endured. It had become part of the identity of upstate New York. Towns celebrated canal days, and songs were written about it. Songs like Low Bridge, Everybody Down, which captured the simple rhythmic life aboard those narrow boats. The melody was cheerful, but behind it was a quiet nostalgia, a recognition that an era was slipping away. If you stood on one of the old towpaths in the 1880s, you might see both past and future side by side. On one side, a slow canal boat pulled by mules. On the other, a roaring train charging across a steel bridge. The contrast was striking. 2 centuries colliding in the open air. Some people called it progress. Others simply called it change. In many canal towns, the economy shifted. Mills that once ground flour for export began to close. Blacksmiths turned to repairing train wheels instead of boat chains. The young left for bigger cities, Syracuse, Rochester, Buffalo, searching for work. The old stayed behind, keeping the memory of the canal alive in small ways. A story told over dinner, a photo on a mantle, a quiet walk along the bank at sunset. For a while, the canal adapted. The state enlarged it again and again, creating what became known as the New York State Barge Canal. It was deeper, wider, meant for motorized boats instead of mule-drawn barges. But the essence was the same water, the same slow patience. In some places, the old Erie Canal was abandoned entirely, its water diverted, its locks left to crumble. Yet nature had a way of reclaiming it gently. Wildflowers grew along the edges. Frogs returned. Trees leaned in over the still water like old friends keeping watch. By the early 20th century, the canal's purpose had shifted from commerce to memory. It no longer defined the nation's economy, but it defined a certain kind of American spirit, one that valued quiet determination over speed. Historians wrote about it as a triumph of willpower. Artists painted its curves and reflections. Travelers came not to trade, but to see what remained of a time when the nation had been young and endlessly hopeful. Some said the canal belonged to another world entirely, a world where progress meant digging through rock with shovels and belief, not building engines or stock exchanges. But others saw in its calm waters a lesson for modern times, that growth need not always be loud to be meaningful. It is easy now, from our perspective, to look back and call it quaint, but to the people who lived beside it, The canal was a living force. It carried not just goods, but gossip, news, and ideas. It spread language, religion, politics. Some historians argue that the canal helped shape the very idea of American democracy, because it connected distant communities and allowed conversation to flow as freely as water. You could trace entire social movements along the canal's route. Abolitionists spreading their message from town to town. Reformers traveling with pamphlets and sermons. Women organizing for rights and education. The canal was both a road and a river of thought. It moved people, and it moved minds. And as much as it tied the East to the West, it also tied generations together. Grandfathers who had worked on its construction would sit beside grandsons who now watched trains pass overhead, telling them that once, before the rails and the noise, there was only the slow whisper of water and the steady creak of rope. The canal aged gracefully. Even in decline, it did not protest. It simply adapted, shrinking back into the landscape that had once resisted it. When the last mule teams were retired, there were ceremonies. Small, heartfelt gatherings of men and women who had spent their lives walking those towpaths. Some cried, others smiled quietly, knowing that the world they had helped build would keep moving, even without them. Today, historians describe that period as the twilight of the canal era, but the word twilight feels right for another reason too. Twilight is not an ending. It's a soft, slow fading of light. It's peaceful, reflective, beautiful in its own way. That was the Erie Canal in its later years. A mirror of a country learning to say goodbye to one chapter while turning toward another. If you listen closely, you can still hear echoes of that world. The splash of water against stone, the call of a canal captain urging his mules forward, the laughter of a child skipping stones. They belong to a time when America moved at the pace of patience, when distance was measured not in miles per hour, but in the number of locks between two towns. And maybe that's why the story of the Erie Canal still matters. It reminds us that progress doesn't always roar. Sometimes it hums softly through the water, leaving ripples that never quite disappear. The canal may have lost its boats and its commerce, but it never lost its calm. It became something rarer, a memory that refuses to fade, a reflection of a nation that once found greatness not in speed, but in persistence. The Erie Canal began as a daring idea, lived as a triumph, and grew old with grace. It watched generations come and go, inventions rise and fall, and through it all, it remained what it had always been. A quiet line of connection through the heart of a restless country. If you stand beside it today, you'll feel that stillness, that deep, almost sacred calm. The water may no longer carry boats, but it carries stories. It carries the echo of every footstep on the towpath, every laugh, every whisper. The canal doesn't speak loudly. It never did. But if you stop long enough to listen, it will tell you everything. By the time the 20th century opened its eyes, America had become a different place. The once young nation, stitched together by rivers and canals, now pulsed with the rhythm of machines. Steam had given way to electricity. Horses had surrendered to engines. The world that had once moved at the pace of a mule now raced forward on wheels and rails. And somewhere along that rush, the Erie Canal stood quietly, watching, aging, remembering. In 1905, the canal still existed, but not as it once had. It had been rebuilt, deepened, widened, renamed the New York State Barge Canal, an effort to keep it relevant in the age of industry. Engineers believed that if the canal could handle larger, motorized barges, it might still compete with the railroads. For a while, that dream seemed alive. Barges carrying grain, coal, and cement still moved slowly between Buffalo and Albany. The sound of diesel engines replaced the creak of ropes and the bray of mules. But something essential had changed. The romance was gone. Where once there had been laughter and community along the towpaths, there was now the distant growl of machines. The canal had become efficient but quieter in spirit. The small towns that had depended on it for life began to look elsewhere for their future. Factories rose, cars appeared, and the hum of industry filled the air. The waterway that had once carried the heart of the nation now seemed like a relic. Beautiful, yes, but unnecessary. And yet, for many, the canal was still home. Old lock tenders continued their work with quiet pride. They kept the gears greased, the gates strong, even when fewer boats came through. Their hands were worn from decades of labor, their eyes accustomed to watching water rise and fall, as predictable as breathing. Some of them had fathers and grandfathers who had worked the same locks. They didn't think of history. They simply did their job, one lock at a time. The early 1900s brought something else too, the automobile. Roads began to stretch across the countryside, connecting towns in ways that canals once had. What the Erie Canal had been to the 1820s, the highway would become to the 1920s. And with that shift, the canal's fate was sealed. Still, it refused to die. It remained patient, as if waiting for the world to slow down again. Even as trucks rumbled past and factories smoked on the horizon, the canal's waters stayed calm, reflecting the changing sky above. In summer, children still came to fish along its banks. Couples walked hand in hand by the locks. In winter, when the water froze, boys skated and laughed, just as they had 100 years before. The canal might have lost its purpose, but it had not lost its presence. The Great Depression hit the canal towns hard. Industries closed, trade dwindled, and the few remaining canal workers watched as the boats became fewer each year. Yet strangely, in that stillness, the canal found a new kind of beauty. Artists began to paint it. Its quiet bridges, its slow bends, its empty locks filled with autumn leaves. Writers found poetry in its decay. To them, the Erie Canal became a symbol, not of failure but of endurance. During World War II, the canal stirred again. Barges carried supplies and materials vital for the war effort. Old locks that hadn't been used in years creaked open once more. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the canal had found purpose again. Not glory, but usefulness. But when the war ended, the old silence returned. The highways grew busier. Airplanes shrieked overhead. The water returned to its quiet rhythm, reflecting a sky that had moved on. By the 1950s, the world had forgotten how to move slowly. Television brought noise into every home. Suburbs spread across fields that once bordered the canal. People no longer spoke of Clinton's Ditch or the Grand Canal. To younger generations, it was just a body of water, something their grandparents talked about. And yet, even as the world hurried past, the canal kept its patience. It had seen centuries of change, and it knew that everything, even progress, eventually settles. Some parts of the canal were filled in, buried under roads or rail lines. In other places, nature reclaimed what man had left behind. Trees took root in crumbling stonework. Birds nested in old lock houses. The water that once carried commerce now carried reflections of clouds, of leaves, of time itself. But not everyone forgot. A few historians, local enthusiasts, and travelers began to rediscover the canal in the 1960s and 1970s. They saw it not as an obsolete industrial relic, but as a living thread of American history. They organized tours, restored towpaths, and fought to preserve what remained. And slowly, quietly, the Erie Canal found a new life, not as a highway of trade, but as a pathway of memory. Families came to walk the same paths their ancestors had once trod. Cyclists rode along its gentle curves. Children listened to stories of the old boats, the mules, and the men who dug the canal by hand. The canal became, in its later life, a teacher, not of economics or engineering, but of patience and connection. Even as late as the 1980s, you could find old men sitting by the locks at dusk remembering. They would talk about the time when boats moved like clockwork, when the sound of water meant work and not nostalgia. Their voices would soften when they spoke of the mules, the stubborn, loyal animals that had pulled America forward, one towpath at a time. They spoke, too, of the community the canal had created, the friendships formed between towns, the shared understanding that progress wasn't a straight line, but a winding waterway that took time, effort, and faith. One man once said, the canal didn't just move water, it moved lives. And perhaps he was right. By the turn of the 21st century, the Erie Canal had completed its transformation. It was no longer an artery of trade, but a corridor of reflection. Parks lined its banks. Old warehouses were turned into museums and cafes. Tour boats glided where freight once ruled. The sound of laughter returned, softer but genuine. People came not to rush, but to slow down. It's strange how the passage of time can turn utility into beauty. What was once ordinary becomes sacred simply because it survived. The Erie Canal, which began as a practical solution to a transportation problem, had become something far greater. A reminder of what human hands and hope can build when they work in rhythm. Standing by the canal today, you can feel its age in the air, not decay, but wisdom. The stones of the old locks are smooth from centuries of water and weather. The towpaths are quiet, lined with wildflowers. Every ripple on the surface seems to whisper an old story of workers digging in mud, of governors dreaming of the impossible, of towns rising from nothing. There's a calmness here that you won't find in highways or cities. It's the calm that comes when something has done its work and no longer needs to prove anything. The canal doesn't compete with trains or cars anymore. It simply exists, timeless, reflective, content. And maybe that's what makes the story of the Erie Canal so deeply American. It's not just a story of ambition or engineering. It's a story of cycles, of rising, falling, and enduring. It reminds us that progress always comes at a cost, and that sometimes the things we leave behind are the ones that end up teaching us the most. There's a kind of poetry in the way the canal mirrors the sky at sunset. The colors shift slowly, gold to orange, orange to deep blue. It's as if the water remembers every light that's ever touched it. You can almost imagine the ghosts of the old canal boats drifting through the mist, their silhouettes fading like memory. Even now, on quiet evenings, locals say you can hear faint echoes, the splash of a paddle, the low hum of a voice, the creak of an invisible rope. Maybe it's just imagination, or maybe the canal still carries the sound of its own history, looping endlessly through time. The Erie Canal never became obsolete, not truly. It simply changed its purpose. Once it carried the weight of a young nation's dreams. Now it carries the echo of its journey. And in a way, that's what all of us do. We begin with purpose, we labor, we change, and then we become stories waiting to be told. As you walk along its banks, the world feels slower, more deliberate. You begin to notice things. The way the light plays on the water, the hum of cicadas, the scent of wet earth after rain. You realize that the canal isn't a monument to the past, but a conversation between then and now. It asks you to remember, but also to listen. And if you listen long enough, you'll hear what generations before us already knew. That greatness is not measured by noise, but by endurance. That progress means nothing without patience, and that sometimes the most extraordinary histories are the ones that unfold quietly, beneath the surface of time. In the quiet dawn of the 21st century, the Erie Canal breathes again, not with the noise of commerce or the strain of labor, but with the calm pulse of memory. The water still moves slowly and deliberately, beneath bridges older than any living soul. Towns that once thrived on its banks are smaller now, quieter, their main streets lined with antique shops and faded brick facades. Yet there's something alive in that stillness, something that feels almost sacred, as if the canal, after 2 centuries, has found peace with its place in time. Every summer, tourists come to walk or cycle along the old towpaths. They trace the same route that mules once followed, unaware that beneath their feet lies the story of America's first great act of imagination. The air smells of pine and water and history. Birds skim the surface, leaving ripples that fade before they reach the next bend. A few pleasure boats move slowly through the locks, their engines humming softly. The lock tenders, now volunteers, mostly retirees, wave and smile. They are keepers of a tradition, performing an old ritual for a new world. To see the canal today is to look at time itself made visible. Everything about it invites slowness. The water does not hurry. The trees do not rush to grow. Even the reflections on the surface seem reluctant to move. And for a society that measures life in notifications, in speed, in urgency, that slowness feels radical. People come here to disconnect, though the irony is that they are really coming to reconnect, not with technology, but with something quieter and deeper. Some walk the towpath in silence, listening to the rustle of leaves, the hum of cicadas, the faint creak of a distant bridge. Others stop to read the weathered plaques that tell pieces of the canal's story. When it was dug, how many men worked it, how it changed the country. But history written in bronze cannot capture what lingers in the air, the invisible presence of everything that happened here. It's easy to forget that this quiet ribbon of water once carried half of America's economy, that through these locks and gates the foundation of New York's greatness was built. The canal made cities rise, made fortunes grow, and turned dreams into geography. And yet now, it sits peacefully among trees and fields, not demanding attention, but rewarding it. It no longer serves the body of the nation, but its memory. There's a museum in a small town called Lockport, a place built around the famous Flight of 5 locks, where boats once rose and fell in a cascade of water and stone. Inside, old tools are displayed behind glass, rusted shovels, hand-forged picks, the wooden pegs used to measure depth. The people who visit often linger, as if sensing the weight of those objects. How many hands they passed through, how many lives they built and broke. The museum smells faintly of oil and dust, but also of reverence. You can almost feel the echo of those who worked here. Men who carved a nation one scoop of mud at a time. Outside, the canal flows as it always has. Children ride bicycles along its banks, their laughter mixing with the sound of wind and water. For them, it's just a pretty place. A good spot for a picnic, a photo, a quiet afternoon. They may not yet understand what it means to live in the shadow of something that once changed the world. But one day perhaps they will. Because the Erie Canal has a way of teaching through presence. It doesn't demand that you learn. It simply waits for you to notice. In recent decades, efforts have been made to preserve and celebrate the canal. Festivals are held each year. Small parades of boats, folk music, reenactments. Local schools bring children to walk the paths and learn about the workers, the locks, the long journey from dream to reality. But what makes these celebrations beautiful isn't their size, it's their sincerity. There's a quiet pride in remembering something so humble, so patient, and so human. The canal has also found a new identity in the modern world. The old towpaths have become one of the longest continuous recreational trails in America. Stretching across New York State from Albany to Buffalo, cyclists travel for days along it, following the same route once mapped by mule drivers and canal captains. The journey is slow, deliberate, a counterpoint to the rush of the interstates that hum just a few miles away. Many who make the trip describe it as transformative. They say the rhythm of pedaling beside the water, hearing nothing but wind and the faint trickle of movement, feels like stepping into another century. And in a sense, it is another century, or perhaps all centuries at once, because the Erie Canal has never truly belonged to one time. It has been the artery of progress, the ghost of memory, and now the sanctuary of reflection. It has been forgotten and rediscovered, ignored and adored, abandoned and revived. Through all of it, it has simply continued. Not defiant, not resigned, but present. Modern America has changed beyond anything the canal's builders could have imagined. The nation's economy now moves at the speed of light. Ships cross oceans that can be tracked from satellites. Goods are ordered with a click and delivered by drones. But somewhere between all that motion and efficiency, there remains a longing for the kind of stillness the canal offers. The Erie Canal is no longer a means of transportation. It's a reminder of perspective. It tells us that progress is not the same as meaning, that even in a world of constant acceleration, the most powerful moments are often the quiet ones. A boat gliding through still water, a child skipping stones, an old man standing by the lock at sunset remembering his father's stories. You could say the canal mirrors America itself, built from ambition, tested by time, scarred by change, but still flowing. Every ripple in its surface carries a reflection of that story. The faith that something ordinary can become extraordinary if enough people believe in it. There's a spot near Syracuse where the canal narrows, framed by willow trees that lean over like guardians. On certain evenings, when the light is low and golden, the water turns into glass. You can see the reflection of both trees and sky, as if heaven and earth were meeting in the canal's surface. Standing there, it's hard not to feel a kind of gratitude, not just for the past, but for the persistence of memory itself. Because what the Erie Canal teaches, more than anything, is endurance. It teaches that creation matters, even when the world moves on. That the act of building, of dreaming something into existence, leaves traces far beyond its usefulness. The men and women who built the canal could never have imagined electric cars, digital maps, or the internet. Yet their work still shapes the landscape, still carries meaning, still connects people who will never know their names. Every great story has its arc: beginning, triumph, decline, rediscovery. The Erie Canal's story follows that pattern perfectly. But what makes it extraordinary is that its ending is not an ending at all. It is a continuation, a gentle reminder that history doesn't vanish. It transforms. If you stand by the canal today, perhaps in the early morning when mist clings to the water, you might feel that continuity. The same water that once carried wooden boats still moves beneath your feet. The same stones that held the lock still hold them now. The same quiet breeze that brushed across the shoulders of Irish laborers 2 centuries ago still touches your skin. Time folds here softly. There are few places left in America where the past feels this close, this alive, not as a museum exhibit or a monument, but as a living rhythm. The canal hums with that rhythm still, a low, steady whisper that says, remember. Remember the dream that built it. Remember the hands that dug it. Remember that greatness once meant patience, and courage once looked like ordinary men with shovels. The Erie Canal was never meant to be eternal, and yet somehow it is. Not in commerce or conquest, but in the quiet persistence of water, moving, always moving, even when no one is watching. And maybe that's the truest kind of legacy. Not the one written in history books, but the one that flows beneath them, unseen, unchanged, still carrying us forward in ways we don't even realize. In the end, the canal doesn't ask to be admired or mourned. It simply asks to be noticed, to be seen not as something that once was, but as something that still is. A living reflection of what America was brave enough to build and wise enough, eventually, to remember. And as the sun sets behind the old bridges and the light fades across the water, you begin to understand. The story of the Erie Canal isn't about a waterway at all. It's about time, endurance, and the quiet strength of human will. It's about the beauty of what remains when the noise of progress finally falls silent. Because long after the trains have gone, after the highways have aged, after the cities have changed their names and faces, the water will still be here, flowing patiently through the heart of New York, whispering to anyone who stops to listen, we were here, we built, we endured, and we still flow. When you visit the Erie Canal today, you don't just see water and stone. You see time, layered, folded, quietly breathing. You see what remains after ambition fades, after progress forgets, after noise falls silent. It's easy to think the canal's story ended long ago, sealed in the 19th century like an old photograph. But the truth is, the Erie Canal never truly ended. It adapted. It found new ways to live, not in the grand gestures of commerce, but in the subtle rhythms of everyday life. In the small town of Fairport, east of Rochester, the canal cuts through the heart of the community like a slow-moving artery. On summer evenings, families gather along the banks, eating ice cream, listening to live music drifting from a nearby cafe. Boats glide by, not the heavy barges of the past, but leisure cruisers, kayaks, and paddleboards. Their reflections shimmer in the fading sunlight. The lock gates open and close with a mechanical sigh, a sound older than anyone standing there. And people pause to watch, not because it's extraordinary, but because it's grounding. The canal is no longer the center of American industry. Something quieter, maybe even wiser. It has become a mirror, of place, of memory, of what we value when we slow down enough to notice. In a world that celebrates speed, the canal reminds us that the best things in life move at the pace of attention. Every lock and bridge has a caretaker now, though their job is less about control and more about preservation. They keep the old systems working, the gears, the gates, the water levels. When you talk to them, they speak with a reverence usually reserved for art. It's alive, one of them said once, his hand resting on the iron railing. You can feel it breathing, even when no one's here. The canal's quiet resurgence has given rise to a kind of slow tourism. People come from across the country to walk, bike, or boat along its 363 miles. They come seeking something they can't quite name. A feeling of connection, perhaps, or continuity. Some call it nostalgia, but it's more than that. It's the search for grounding in a world that rarely stops moving. They stay in converted lockhouses, eat in century-old taverns, and watch the sunrise reflected on still water. For many, it becomes a form of meditation. There are moments when the canal feels like a living museum, but not in the curated sense, more like a wild archive that refuses to be forgotten. Nature has softened its edges. Trees lean closer, reeds whisper against the water's skin, fish ripple the surface, and the hum of insects fills the space where once there was the clang of industry. The canal has become its own ecosystem again, one that blurs the line between history and habitat. In the evenings, when the light turns amber and the water reflects the sky's last warmth, the canal becomes a ribbon of memory stretching across New York. Towns like Canajoharie, Little Falls, and Lyons glow softly along its edge. Their downtowns, some barely changed since the 1800s, hold stories in every brick. Old warehouses have become coffee shops and art galleries. Abandoned mills are now breweries or apartments. It's as if the past has learned to breathe through the present. One evening in Pittsford, a small group gathers by the canal for a storytelling event. Local historians, teachers, and retirees sit in a circle of folding chairs as the sun dips behind the trees. They tell stories, not just of the canal's construction, but of the lives shaped by it. A woman in her 70s recalls her grandfather, who worked as a lock tender in the 1930s. He used to say the water had moods. She laughs softly. Some days it was calm, some days restless. He swore it could tell when a storm was coming. Another man, a school teacher, shares how he brings his students to the canal every spring. They think history is what's written in books, he says. But then they stand here, they see the gates move, they hear the water rush, and suddenly they get it. History isn't something that happened. It's something still happening. That's the quiet revelation of the Erie Canal. It shows us that history doesn't vanish into the past. It settles into the landscape. It becomes part of who we are, even when we stop noticing. The canal has also become a thread of identity for New York State itself. In 2017, the bicentennial of its construction was celebrated across hundreds of communities. There were boat parades, lectures, art installations, even musical performances inspired by the rhythms of the locks. It wasn't just nostalgia, it was gratitude. Gratitude for the people who dreamed it, built it, preserved it, and kept it alive through centuries of change. If you listen closely near certain bends, you can still hear traces of the old canal songs, the work chants and folk tunes sung by the men who dug the waterway by hand. Some were Irish, some German, some freedmen from the South. They sang to keep time, to ease the weight of labor, to remind themselves that what they were building would outlive them. And it did. Their songs, though long forgotten in melody, still echo in the rhythm of water hitting stone. The canal's endurance is a quiet defiance against the idea that progress means replacement. We often build, abandon, rebuild, always chasing the next innovation. But the Erie Canal has shown that progress can also mean adaptation. It didn't resist change. It flowed with it. It became something new without erasing what it once was. In an age when technology moves faster than thought, the canal's pace feels almost spiritual. It invites people to slow down, to observe, to breathe. Artists paint its reflections. Writers describe its moods. Photographers capture its misty mornings. Some say it's hauntingly beautiful. Others call it ordinary, but perhaps its beauty lies exactly there, in being ordinary, and reminding us that the ordinary is sacred. When the canal freezes in winter, it transforms again. The water turns to glass and the world above it goes silent. Locals skate along the surface, their laughter echoing against the frozen banks. Snow falls softly over the old towpaths. The bridges creak with cold. In the quiet, the canal feels timeless, as if it has stepped out of history altogether. Sometimes, in those moments, you can almost imagine the ghosts of its builders standing along the banks, watching. Perhaps they smile, seeing what has become of their labor. Not forgotten, not erased, but woven into the rhythm of life itself. The canal has outlived its purpose, yet found new meaning. That's something few creations ever achieve. At night, when the towns sleep and the canal lies under a blanket of stars, it feels alive in another way. The water reflects constellations older than the nation itself. Crickets sing. The occasional boat passes, its lantern casting ripples of light across the surface. Somewhere far away, a train hums, a descendant of the same progress that once made the canal obsolete. And yet here the two coexist, the fast and the slow, the new and the old, the fleeting and the enduring. That coexistence is what defines the canal today. It's not about nostalgia or preservation alone. It's about balance. The Erie Canal reminds us that not everything needs to vanish to make room for what's next. Some things, if we're careful, can remain, steady, patient, whispering reminders of where we came from. People who live near it often describe an odd kind of comfort. They say it's not just water, it's presence, a kind of companionship that asks for nothing. Maybe that's why, even after 200 years, the Erie Canal still matters. Not as an artifact, but as a teacher. It teaches patience, that greatness is built slowly. It teaches humility, that even the mightiest innovations fade, but meaning endures. It teaches perspective, that the future always grows from the past, like water feeding new ground. If you stand by the canal at dawn, when mist curls over the surface and light filters through the trees, you can almost hear it speaking, not in words but in rhythm. The soft lapping of water against stone, the creak of an old gate, the sigh of the wind through tall grass. It says, everything changes, but nothing is truly lost. And that, perhaps, is the real story of the Erie Canal. Not just how it was built or what it achieved, but how it continues, quietly, persistently, like water finding its way through time. Even as the world races ahead, the canal remains, an ancient mirror reflecting what progress leaves behind and what it can never replace. The sound of stillness, the memory of movement, the proof that even in a nation built on forward motion, there's still power in standing still. So the next time someone calls the Erie Canal boring, maybe they're right, but not in the way they think. It's boring because it asks you to slow down, to listen, to see. It's boring because it doesn't perform for attention. It just exists, calm, enduring, and quietly beautiful. And in that calmness lies something the modern world desperately needs, a reminder that the truest stories are not the loudest, but the ones that whisper across centuries, carried by water, reflected in light, and remembered by those who choose to stop and listen. There comes a point in every story when the noise fades and only the echoes remain. For the Erie Canal, that moment isn't a conclusion. It's a continuation that stretches quietly into the horizon. What began as a line of water carved through wilderness has become something greater than its makers ever imagined. A current of memory flowing through generations. It's hard to describe what happens when you stand beside the canal in the early hours, before the sun lifts its first light over the trees. The air is still, the water barely stirs, and the world feels suspended between centuries. You can almost sense the ghost of motion, the echo of ropes creaking, the muffled thud of hooves on wet earth, the distant shout of a canal captain calling through fog. They are gone, of course, but not completely. The canal holds their presence the way a photograph holds light, faint but eternal. In a way, that's what the canal has always been. Not just a path for water, but a vessel for memory. Every ripple, every reflection, every whisper of current carries fragments of the millions of lives that once moved through it. Some were heroes in small ways. Builders, traders, mothers waiting at docks. Others left no names behind, just footprints washed away by time. But together, they built something that outlasted them all. And now, centuries later, people come not to work or to trade, but to remember, even if they don't realize that's what they're doing. They come to walk, to breathe, to pause. The Erie Canal offers something rare in modern life. Space. Space to think. Space to feel. Space to listen to silence. On certain mornings, mist hovers above the water, rolling like slow breath. The canal becomes a mirror for the sky. Soft gray, streaked with light. A heron glides low across the surface, wings brushing the reflection of trees that have stood since before the revolution. A fisherman sits quietly on the bank, line cast into stillness. He doesn't speak. He doesn't need to. The canal speaks for him. What is it that draws us to old places like this? Maybe it's the reassurance that the world was not always so fast. Maybe it's the reminder that endurance has its own kind of beauty. Or maybe it's simply the peace that comes from realizing that everything, even history, continues to move, but at its own rhythm. There's a lock near a small town called Macedon, where the old machinery still works. The same cast iron gears, the same wooden gates, the same slow descent of water rising and falling. Watching it is like watching time breathe. Each movement is deliberate, patient, full of purpose, but without urgency. There's a dignity in that slowness, a quiet strength that modern life rarely allows. Sometimes a family will stop to watch, parents holding their children's hands as the gates close and the water rises. The children look in wonder, as if it's magic, and in a way it is. 2 centuries ago, this was the cutting edge of progress. Now it's a relic, but one that still works, still matters, still teaches. The canal doesn't resist obsolescence. It transforms it into wisdom. In the nearby towns, the people who live along the canal see it as both neighbor and teacher. They talk about it the way others might talk about a relative, with affection, respect, and a hint of awe. They speak of its moods, how it glows at dusk, how it darkens before storms, how it hums in summer when the air is thick with heat and insects. They know it the way you know someone you've lived beside your whole life, quietly, without needing words. For them, the Erie Canal isn't a monument, it's a companion, a reminder that the past is not gone, only resting. There's a cafe in the town of Middleport where the tables sit right along the edge of the water. Travelers come in, order coffee, sit by the window, and stare at the slow drift of current. Conversations fade into silence. Something about the place invites reflection. You don't realize how much noise the world makes until you find a place that doesn't. In that stillness, people rediscover what history really is. Not just the record of what happened, but the feeling of having come from somewhere. The Erie Canal embodies that feeling. It is both origin and echo, an inheritance we didn't ask for but are lucky to have. As night falls, the water darkens to ink, and lights from small boats shimmer like constellations reflected upside down. Somewhere far off, a bell rings, soft, metallic, ancient. The sound lingers, mixing with the scent of damp wood and river grass. It feels like time calling to itself. If you listen long enough, you realize that the canal's true story isn't about industry or even innovation. It's about connection, between places, between people, between the past and the present. Every lock, every turn, every quiet mile tells the same truth. Progress built the canal, but memory kept it alive. You could say the Erie Canal is the most human of all America's creations, not because it was perfect, but because it carried within it both ambition and humility. It was a declaration of possibility, a belief that the impossible could be carved from earth and water. But it was also fragile, fleeting, and imperfect, like everything we make. That fragility is what gives it meaning. In a century obsessed with speed, the Erie Canal stands as a counterpoint, proof that what moves slowly can last longer, that patience builds more lasting monuments than urgency ever will. And so it remains, a line of water winding through New York State, connecting not just cities, but centuries. The people who visit it don't come for spectacle. They come for presence. They come to stand where history still breathes, to touch the railing of an old locked gate, to hear the creak of wood and water, to feel the weight of time pressing softly around them. The canal doesn't demand that you understand it. It only asks that you stay long enough to listen. And when you do, it tells you something unexpected, not about boats or trade or progress, but about yourself. About the quiet within you that the modern world has made you forget. Standing there, looking at the still water, you realize that the Erie Canal is not just a place. It's a mirror. It reflects what you bring to it. Your restlessness, your longing, your need to remember. It teaches without words, it comforts without promise, and it endures without applause. That is why it matters. Because in its stillness, you can see the entire story of America unfold. The dreaming, the striving, the forgetting, the remembering. You can see the rise and fall of cities, the hum of industry, the silence that follows. You can see the beauty in failure, the dignity in endurance, the grace in time's slow erosion. And maybe, if you stand there long enough, you'll understand something deeper. that history isn't something behind us. It's beneath us, flowing quietly, waiting to be seen. The Erie Canal continues to flow, not because it must, but because it can. Because even when no one watches, the water moves, slow, deliberate, eternal. It is, in its quiet way, a promise. A promise that what we build and hope can outlast the noise of its own making. Long after we're gone, the canal will still be here. A silver line cutting through fields and forests, through towns and time, whispering the same gentle truth it has always known. That movement does not always mean progress. That silence can be full of sound. That history never ends. It only changes form. So when you leave the canal, when you step back into the modern rush of highways and screens and notifications, you carry a little of it with you. A rhythm slower than the world, but steadier. A calm that doesn't fade. And maybe that's what the builders truly left behind. Not just a waterway, but a way of seeing. A reminder that progress without reflection is motion without meaning. That in the stillness of water there is wisdom. The Erie Canal is more than history. It's a heartbeat, slow, patient, and infinite. And if you listen closely, even from miles away, you can still hear it, the sound of water. The memory of hands, the whisper of time, still flowing. Always flowing. Sometimes when the world feels too loud, people still come back to the canal. They may not call it pilgrimage, but that's what it is. A quiet return to something that reminds them who they are and where they came from. The Erie Canal has become more than history. It has become a kind of meditation, a long, slow breath stretched across the heart of New York. Each bend, each lock, each bridge whispers a lesson that can't be found in books. You only understand it when you stand there, when you let the silence speak for you. In the modern day, the canal is surrounded by a new kind of world, one driven by light, speed, and sound. Cars rush past on highways built where mule paths once ran. Drones hum above the trees that once shaded laborers digging with shovels. And yet, even in that constant rush, the canal endures, refusing to hurry. It's strange to think that a piece of 19th century engineering could still shape the rhythm of 21st century lives. But it does. Artists find peace in painting its reflections. Musicians record its echoes. Writers describe it in words that sound almost like prayer. Couples walk along its towpaths at dusk, holding hands without talking. They may not know the history. They don't have to. The canal's presence explains itself. What was once the pulse of industry has become the heartbeat of reflection. And that transformation says something beautiful about both the canal and the country that built it. There's a small bench near the lock at Clyde, old weathered wood facing west. People stop there every evening to watch the sun go down over the still water. Some come alone, some in pairs, some with dogs or cameras or coffee cups. None of them say much. The scene doesn't need commentary. The light glows golden on the surface, turns orange, then crimson, then fades into violet. The water absorbs it all, like memory taking in another day. That's what the Erie Canal has become, a place where light and memory meet. There's something humbling about standing by a structure that's older than every living person around it, yet still functional, still relevant in ways that can't be measured by economy. The canal's usefulness has long since passed, yet its meaning has only deepened. It has shifted from the practical to the spiritual, from a route of commerce to a passage of understanding. You see it in the faces of those who visit, the quiet awe, the soft half-smiles, the way their breathing slows as they walk. The canal has a way of syncing the body's rhythm with its own. Before long, you find yourself moving at its pace. Some of the old canal towns have found ways to reinvent themselves around that pace. In places like Brockport and Rome, local festivals celebrate the canal's history every summer. There's music, fiddles and banjos echoing across the water, and laughter that sounds like something from another century. Boats decorated with lanterns drift past as children chase fireflies along the shore. The air smells of grilled food and old wood and evening dew. It's simple, unpretentious joy, the kind that seems to have disappeared elsewhere. For a few hours, time bends. You could almost believe you've stepped back into a world that valued patience more than progress. At those festivals, old men tell stories about their grandparents who worked on the canal. Young artists sell watercolor paintings of locks and towpaths, Local historians give short talks, their voices warm and reverent. And as the crowd listens, there's a feeling that everyone is part of something larger, not an audience to the past, but participants in its quiet continuation. The Erie Canal teaches that history isn't just dates and facts, it's atmosphere, emotion, continuity. It's the hum of something that keeps going even after its reason to exist has passed. In winter, the canal takes on another kind of beauty. Snow gathers on the banks, covering the towpaths in white. The water slows until it looks like dark glass. In some places it freezes completely. Local kids still come to skate, their laughter echoing through the cold air. The sound of blades cutting through ice mixes with the creak of the wind across wooden bridges. It's peaceful, but alive, as if the canal dreams during the winter months, storing up the sunlight it will release come spring. Sometimes, a red fox appears at dawn, padding silently along the edge of the frozen water. Birds leave trails in the snow. Steam rises from the water where it hasn't frozen yet. There's beauty in the stillness. Not the grand kind, but the kind that stays with you. The canal shows that stillness doesn't mean absence. It means presence, distilled. There are moments, especially at twilight, when the canal seems to dissolve the boundaries of time altogether. You can almost feel the presence of every century that has touched it. The laughter of the first settlers, the creak of wooden barges, the sigh of the industrial age giving way to something quieter. All of it flows together, layered like sediment beneath the surface. In that sense, the canal isn't a relic. It's a living memory. And living memories don't fade. They evolve. A historian once said, "The Erie Canal is not America's past. It's America's reflection." He was right. Because to understand the canal is to understand the country, its ambition, its restlessness, its need to keep moving even when stillness might serve it better. The canal shows us that our greatest creations come not from hurry, but from endurance. Every generation rediscovers the canal in its own way. For some, it's an escape from city noise. For others, it's a photographic pilgrimage, a chance to capture light as it plays on old water. For others still, it's a symbol of what it means to build something meant to last. One could argue that the Erie Canal represents a kind of national soul, one that values creation not for its glamour, but for its persistence. A soul that knows real progress comes not from speed, but from steady work done with belief. You can see that belief still alive in those who maintain the locks, clean the pathways, and organize the small community groups that keep the canal open to the public. They aren't famous and they don't seek recognition. They just care. They do what generations before them did. They keep the water flowing. Sometimes the canal floods after a heavy rain. The water rises over the banks, reminding everyone that nature still has the final word. The cleanup that follows is quiet but communal. Neighbors come together, volunteers bring tools, and for a few days the town works as one, just as it did 2 centuries ago when the canal was being built. It's strange but beautiful, how an old waterway can still bring people together like that. And when the waters settle again, when the current returns to its soft whisper, you can almost feel the canal exhale, patient, forgiving, eternal. In the deep of night, when the world sleeps, the canal becomes something close to sacred. The moonlight glides along the surface like silver smoke. Owls call from the trees. Somewhere in the distance, water moves through an old lock, slow and steady. The sound is ancient, comforting, like the heartbeat of the earth itself. Standing there, you realize that the canal has been watching the world change for 200 years. Empires have risen and fallen, cities have grown and faded, machines have replaced men, but the water still flows. The same current that once carried wooden barges now reflects satellites and airplane trails. Time has changed everything around it, yet it remains, teaching by example what it means to endure. And that endurance feels like a message, one meant for all of us who move too quickly, who forget too easily. The Erie Canal doesn't tell us to stop, it tells us to remember while we move, to carry our past with us not as a burden but as ballast, the weight that keeps us steady in motion. That's why people keep coming back. Not because the canal is spectacular, but because it's steady, because it stands as proof that even in a restless world, peace is possible. In the end, that may be its greatest gift. Not its history, not its scale, but its silence. A silence that invites reflection, a silence that reminds us that even the smallest ripples can carry the longest echoes. And so the canal continues, quietly, patiently, without fanfare or applause. Its water still moves beneath bridges older than the modern dream, beneath skies that have watched centuries pass. If you stand there long enough, in the stillness, in the hush between dusk and dark, you might hear it. The sound not of progress or industry, but of presence. A sound that says we endure, we remember, we flow. Night settled over the canal like a soft blanket. The air held the faint chill of early autumn, and the water reflected the silver of a half moon. The world was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you feel history breathing. Slow, patient, unhurried. The same stillness that had rested here 200 years ago now lingered again, unchanged. Somewhere far away, a train whistle echoed. Faint, almost like a memory trying to return. That sound marked the passing of time, but here along the canal, time didn't really pass. It circled back on itself again and again, looping through memory like a current that refuses to fade. As dawn began to unfold, a pale mist drifted across the water. Dew gathered on the grass. The canal's banks, once lined with workers and mules, now stood empty but dignified, as if still waiting for a purpose. And in a way it was, because every generation somehow finds a new way to bring it back to life. In the early 20th century, the canal had already begun to fade from the nation's attention. Trains had taken its purpose. Highways were coming soon. The once bustling waterway grew silent. Many locks fell into disrepair. Some stretches dried. Towns that had thrived on canal trade watched their docks rot slowly, their warehouses empty out. The great artery of commerce had become, almost overnight, a relic. Yet even then, there were those who couldn't let it go. Old canal workers kept visiting the banks where they once toiled. Fishermen dropped lines where barges had passed. Children played among the stones of forgotten locks, unaware they were climbing over history. The canal, even in its quiet decline, continued to hold people, not through necessity, but through nostalgia. In the 1930s, when America was deep in the Great Depression, there were talks of filling parts of it in, turning its path into farmland or roads. But others protested quietly, saying that something sacred shouldn't be erased just because it had outlived its usefulness. That idea, that history deserved to remain visible, saved the canal. Then came the 1940s and 50s, the age of highways and post-war speed. America was moving faster than ever before, and the Erie Canal was slower than ever. Yet while people sped west in cars, the canal waited. It didn't compete. It simply endured. And in that endurance, something beautiful happened. As industrial smoke cleared and cities grew restless, the old towns along the canal began to rediscover what they had forgotten: peace. Families came to picnic by the water. Young couples walked the towpaths at sunset. Retired veterans sat on benches, staring at the reflection of clouds and saying nothing at all. The canal, once a machine for movement, became a mirror for stillness. By the late 20th century, local governments began restoring sections of it, not as trade routes, but as heritage trails. Engineers cleaned locks that hadn't opened in 50 years. Volunteers cleared debris and built wooden docks where visitors could launch canoes. What was once infrastructure had quietly become landscape. The Erie Canal was reborn, not through force, but through love. In the 1970s and 80s, artists began painting its bridges and waters. Poets wrote about the sound of wind along its stone walls. Photographers captured the morning mist, the symmetry of still water, the geometry of reflection. Each work seemed to carry the same unspoken message, that the canal was more than history. It was memory turned visible. It wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't profitable, but it was real. And as decades passed, the canal began to find a new identity, not as a route between two ports, but as a thread connecting generations. People came not to ship goods, but to feel grounded. Kayakers paddled where barges once drifted. Cyclists followed towpaths that had carried mules. The canal no longer carried America's economy. It carried its quiet need for connection. In a world that had become too fast, the canal's slowness felt like grace. Standing beside it, one couldn't help but think of those who dug it. Men who had no idea that their work would outlast every empire and invention that followed. The same hands that once shoveled mud now seemed to reach through time, steadying the nation that had forgotten what endurance meant. By the early 2000s, the canal had become part of the Erie Canalway National Heritage Corridor. Trails stretched hundreds of miles, connecting old towns like beads on a long thread. Historical signs stood beside picnic tables, quietly explaining how this once changed the world. And though few stopped to read, the message was there, carved in steel and memory. At Lock E19 near Frankfurt, an elderly man still raises and lowers the gates every summer. Tourists come by boat, small, modern, colorful, and they smile when he waves. "It's slower this way," he says, "but you see more when you go slow." His words sound like an echo of the canal itself. There are places along the canal where the modern world disappears completely. You can stand there in the early morning light and see the same landscape that workers saw in 1825. The same trees, the same water, the same mist. The only difference is the silence, deeper now, fuller somehow, as if the canal has spent centuries learning how to speak without words. It's in that silence that you realize what the Erie Canal has become. Not a monument to achievement, but a meditation on persistence. Every era leaves something behind: roads, bridges, machines, and ruins. But very few leave behind something that can still breathe. The canal breathes, not through motion, but through memory. It moves even when still, because it carries within it the echoes of everything that ever passed along its waters. As the years turn, more people begin to understand this. Artists host canal nights where they project films on the water's surface. Musicians play slow, drifting tunes that seem to blend with the ripples. Writers come here to think, families come here to rest. The canal no longer defines commerce, it defines calm. And that calm is rare now. You can feel it most clearly at dusk, when the day softens into amber light. The air cools and the sounds of life, the distant hum of cars, the murmur of voices, the occasional splash of a fish, all settle into rhythm with the water's steady pulse. It feels like the whole world exhales. Standing there, you begin to sense something that every builder, traveler, and dreamer once felt. That stillness can carry meaning, too. That progress isn't just about moving forward. It's about knowing when to pause, when to look back, when to listen. The Erie Canal doesn't preach this lesson. It simply lives it, even now. As digital screens glow brighter and attention spans grow shorter, the canal remains what it has always been: patient. It doesn't need to change to stay relevant. It simply needs to be. And somehow, in its being, it still teaches. When a breeze stirs the surface, you can almost hear its quiet wisdom, that no era truly ends, and no memory truly fades. They flow one into another, like the canal itself, curving gently, endlessly, westward. The water carries everything: the dreams of those who built it, the reflections of those who now walk beside it, and the whispers of those yet to come. By the time night falls again, the canal glows faintly under the moon. It looks almost unchanged from centuries ago. The same stars, the same horizon, the same soft sound of water against stone. Only the watchers have changed, and in that simple truth lies the canal's greatest legacy: that the world can reinvent itself countless times, but what truly matters, endurance, connection, flexion, never changes. The Erie Canal endures not because it must, but because it chooses to, through the care of those who remember, the quiet awe of those who pause, and the patience of time itself. It continues to flow steady and eternal, reminding us that sometimes the most powerful stories are the quietest ones, the ones that whisper, the ones that wait, the ones that never stop moving, even when they seem perfectly still. The world changes in layers like silt settling in water. You don't notice it at first, one layer then another, each one so thin that it seems harmless. But over years, over lifetimes, the landscape shifts. The Erie Canal has watched that happen longer than most living things ever will. Now, as the 21st century stretches on, The canal stands not just as a line of water cutting through New York, but as a line of memory cutting through America's heart. On quiet mornings, when fog still lingers and the air smells faintly of whetstone and pine, the canal doesn't seem like a man-made creation at all. It feels older, like it was always meant to be here. A vein running through the body of a restless nation. If you walk the towpath today, you'll see signs of new life everywhere. Cyclists pass in slow rhythm, their tires whispering over gravel. Joggers trace the same route that mules once trudged. Elderly couples stroll hand in hand, pointing out birds or ripples in the water. Every few miles, a restored lockhouse stands, its brick walls clean again, its old gears still turning, though now more for demonstration than duty. There's something sacred about the sound of those gears. It's not loud, not mechanical, just a slow creak, a patient turning, like time itself exhaling. The canal's caretakers today are not workers in the old sense. They don't dig or haul, they tend. They clean the paths, oil the gates, guide visitors who come not for trade but for peace. They know every bend, every echo, every whisper of the place. Some of them have spent decades doing this, volunteering their time to preserve something that no longer serves a practical purpose, but still holds a spiritual one. And that, perhaps, is the most American thing about the Erie Canal. It began as ambition, but it endures as devotion. There's a man named Robert who runs a small boat out of Fairport. He's not young anymore, but his voice carries the same calm as the water he loves. Every morning before sunrise, he starts the engine of his narrow blue vessel and glides along the still canal, offering tours to anyone who wants to listen. He doesn't rush. His narration isn't rehearsed. Sometimes he speaks, sometimes he doesn't. When he does, his words sound less like facts and more like memories. "You know," he says one morning as mist curls over the water, "this canal changed everything. It made the impossible ordinary. But the real miracle isn't what it built. It's that it's still here." He pauses, looks out at the reflection of the trees. You can't really destroy something that's made out of patience. The people on his boat rarely answer. They just listen. To him, to the wind, to the slow splash of the wake behind them. It feels almost like a ceremony, one that honors silence as much as history. Later in the day, school children come on field trips. They run along the towpath, laughing, pointing, asking questions about the strange stone structures. Teachers explain locks, barges, trade routes, but the children seem more interested in the dragonflies hovering above the water, or the way sunlight glitters on ripples. They're not learning dates and facts. They're feeling time. Sometimes a few of them stop and ask, did people really dig all this by hand? And when they hear that thousands of men, immigrants, farmers, laborers, carved this line across the state with shovels and sheer endurance, they fall silent for a moment. The idea that something so vast was built by hand seems impossible in their world of instant everything. That small silence, that awe, is exactly what the canal gives. As afternoon fades, the towns along the canal begin to glow with their own quiet rhythm. Fairport, Pittsford, Lockport. Their names still echo the canal's history. Their main streets lined with brick buildings that have stood for over a century. Cafes and bookstores now fill old warehouses. Bicycles lean against stone walls once used to tie up barges. Every corner feels touched by time, yet somehow still alive. At dusk, the light softens over the water. The canal becomes a mirror again, one that reflects both past and present. A heron lands at the edge, folding its long wings with perfect grace. Across the water, the faint sound of laughter drifts from a patio where people eat and talk, without realizing they're sitting atop what used to be a mule towpath. It's in moments like that the canal feels like a kind of bridge, not just between cities, but between eras. When night falls, the streetlights flicker on, their reflections forming golden trails that stretch across the dark surface. You can almost imagine lanterns from the 1800s floating by, carried by invisible hands. It's easy to forget which century you're in. The air smells the same. The stars hang in the same sky, and maybe that's the point. The canal doesn't fight against time. It flows with it. It accepts the world's changes, yet keeps its own rhythm. That's why it endures, not as resistance, but as acceptance. In winter, when the water freezes and snow drapes over the towpath, The canal turns almost otherworldly. The sound disappears. The world feels paused. Children skate on the ice, their laughter echoing across the frosted trees. Old photographs from the 19th century show the same scene. Sleighs, skaters, fires burning in barrels. It's the same story told again, a ritual of continuity. Even the wildlife seems to respect it. Deer cross the frozen surface carefully, as if they know it's more than water. Birds rest on its banks, following routes that have existed longer than nations. The canal isn't just a path for people. It's a sanctuary for everything that moves through the slow currents of existence. Sometimes, when spring comes and the thaw begins, you can hear the faint sound of ice cracking. A long, deep note that vibrates through the earth. It's the sound of renewal, of something ancient remembering how to flow again. And each time it happens, the canal is reborn quietly without announcement. In the small towns nearby, festivals mark the reopening of locks. Banners hang over bridges. Bands play, children wave, and boats begin to move once more. But beneath the celebration, there's a quieter truth. The realization that the canal doesn't belong to any one generation. It belongs to time itself. Every person who touches its water, every eye that follows its curve becomes part of its story. One evening, a young filmmaker sets up a camera at dusk. He's making a documentary about the Erie Canal. Not about its history, but about its presence. He frames the shot carefully, waiting for the moment when the last light fades and the reflections of lamps shimmer just right. As he films, he whispers to himself, "It's not about what happened here. It's about what still happens." That sentiment, quiet, almost prayer-like, captures what the canal has become for modern America. It's not a monument in the usual sense. It doesn't demand awe or ceremony. It invites stillness. It teaches by being, not by declaring. And in a time when everything rushes forward, that stillness feels like wisdom. On certain nights, when the moon is high and the air smells faintly of water and pine, you can stand beside the canal and hear what sounds like breathing. Not wind, not insects. Something deeper, as if the earth itself were remembering its past. You might feel the faint hum of generations. The workers, the traders, the travelers, the dreamers, all still moving quietly within the flow. And for a moment, you realize the canal isn't history frozen in stone and water. It's alive. It flows not just through land, but through time, through memory, through us. And that's when you begin to understand. The Erie Canal was never just about connecting Lake Erie to the Hudson River. It was about connecting humanity to itself. Even now, when most of the world has forgotten the names of the men who built it, the canal remembers. Every ripple carries their effort. Every Lockgate Creek whispers their endurance. Every reflected cloud carries their unseen dreams. The canal continues to do what it has always done, move quietly through the world, shaping it in ways too subtle to measure, too lasting to erase. It doesn't boast. It doesn't fade. It simply exists, patiently teaching anyone willing to pause long enough to listen. And when dawn comes again, spreading gold across the water's face, it all begins anew. The reflections shift. The world stirs. Another day, another century, another quiet continuation of something that refuses to end. Because the canal, in its deepest truth, is not about progress. It's about presence. Night has fallen again, slow and soundless over the long stretch of the canal. The air holds the faint scent of moss and damp wood. In the distance, a train hums faintly. Not loud enough to disturb, just enough to remind you that the world beyond still moves. But here beside the water, time behaves differently. It breathes slower, like the canal itself dictates its rhythm. The reflection of the moon ripples with each faint breeze, breaking into 1,000 fragments and then joining again, as if imitating the way memories work. What we remember is never whole at once. It comes in pieces, rearranged by time, rejoined by emotion. The Erie Canal, in that sense, feels like memory made visible. Every layer of its stillness carries something that once moved: a boat, a voice, a footstep, a breath. The canal doesn't speak, but it remembers everything. Somewhere nearby, an old church bell strikes 10. The sound drifts slowly across the water, fading into the night. You can almost imagine it ringing 100 years ago, marking the same hour, the same peace. There's a strange comfort in knowing that not everything has to change. In the quiet, you start to notice details you wouldn't see in the rush of day. The way the grass bends toward the water, the small insects dancing above its surface, the glint of a submerged stone that might have been part of an old foundation. Everything here is layered, nature reclaiming what industry once built, yet never fully erasing it. That coexistence is what defines the canal now. It's no longer a place of work or progress. It's a place of conversation. Between what was and what is. Between human will and natural patience. Between noise and quiet. In the 19th century, men carved this waterway out of stubborn land, cutting through forest, swamp, and rock to create a connection where none existed. In the 21st, people come here to mend connections. With themselves, with the past, with stillness. What was once an artery of trade has become a sanctuary of reflection. There's a bench near Lock 32, where an elderly woman comes every evening. Locals know her as Mrs. Whitaker. Her husband used to maintain that lock, decades ago, before it was automated, before tourism. He died years back, but she never stopped visiting. Every night just before sunset, she sits quietly, watching the light fade from gold to blue, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She never speaks. She never reads. She just sits, eyes fixed on the water as if she's waiting for something unseen. Some say she's waiting for him. Others think she simply finds peace there. Either way, the canal holds her grief gently. It doesn't demand that she let go. It simply stays, like an old friend who doesn't need to talk to understand. Moments like that make you realize what the canal really is. It's not a monument to progress. It's a testament to patience, to endurance, to the quiet kind of love that refuses to disappear. A few miles east near Palmyra, an artist named James spends his mornings painting the same stretch of canal over and over again. His studio smells of turpentine and morning air. He paints from life, sitting by the bank, brush moving slowly, almost meditatively. He says he's trying to capture how the water changes without changing. He's been at it for 20 years. Dozens of canvases line his walls, each one slightly different in tone. Some bright with morning light, others heavy with fog. But to him, they're not separate paintings. They're one long conversation with the same subject. When asked why he keeps painting the same thing, he smiles faintly and says, "Because the canal never looks the same twice, and neither do I." There's something profoundly human about that, the way we return to what doesn't move, hoping to understand something that does. The Erie Canal offers that kind of mirror. It shows us not what we were, but what we've become by simply enduring. During summer nights, small lanterns float down certain stretches of the canal, part of a local remembrance tradition. People write the names of loved ones on paper lanterns and release them, watching them drift along the water, their reflections glowing in soft ripples. It's a sight both beautiful and haunting. Thousands of lights gliding slowly toward the horizon, carried by the same current that once bore ships full of ambition and grain. Now it carries memories. No one speaks during the event. The silence becomes a language of its own. You can feel it, the quiet connection between strangers, bound by the shared understanding that loss and love are both forms of endurance. The canal receives it all, the tears, the laughter, the echoes of a song hummed under the breath. And in the gentle pull of the water, there's a sense that nothing is truly gone. It all flows somewhere. Some nights, when fog settles thick and the moon hides behind clouds, you can almost believe the past is walking beside you. The faint sound of footsteps on the old towpath, the creak of invisible wood, the quiet murmur of voices carried on the wind. It's not frightening, it's comforting, like time folding in on itself. History isn't behind us here, it's around us. If you listen long enough, you begin to sense that the Erie Canal is not telling a story of what was, but of what is still happening. The act of remembering itself becomes the continuation of history. As dawn breaks, the world turns gold again. Mist rises like smoke from the surface. The first birds call out, breaking the silence but not disturbing it. The canal glows softly, like a long, slow heartbeat stretching from one century to another. In that light, everything looks suspended. The bridges, the trees, the reflections. You can almost imagine time pausing to take a breath. Across the water, a small sign reads, Erie Canalway Trail, 360 miles. It's a simple reminder that this narrow ribbon of water still connects the state from end to end, quietly linking past to present, person to person. But what it connects most deeply, perhaps, is the space inside us, the part that longs for stillness in a world that moves too fast. Later in the day, children ride bicycles along the trail, calling out to each other. An elderly man fishes near the lock gate, the line of his pole bending gently in the breeze. A young woman sits cross-legged on the grass reading a worn book of poetry. Life continues softly. The canal doesn't demand attention. It simply allows it. It gives people permission to slow down, to exist without agenda. In a world of noise, it becomes a rare kind of silence that doesn't feel empty. By evening, the sky deepens into violet. Fireflies flicker along the bank. Their reflections scatter across the water, joining the faint lights from houses on the far side. Everything seems suspended between movement and stillness, sound and silence, past and present. It's easy to forget that beneath that peaceful surface runs a complex system of locks, gates and channels, an entire hidden infrastructure built by hands now long gone. The physical labor of thousands still moves invisibly beneath the water's calm face. That realization humbles you. Every stone here was once lifted by someone who believed they were building something that mattered. And they were right, because centuries later that belief still holds. The canal is their voice still whispering through time. If you sit long enough beside it, you begin to feel your thoughts slow down. The rhythm of your breathing matches the rhythm of the water. The rush of life outside fades, replaced by a deeper awareness that everything, even silence, is alive. There's a small plaque near Lockport that reads, "Built by hand, carried by faith, remembered by patience." 3 simple lines, but they summarize an entire civilization's journey, from ambition to reflection, from progress to peace. And maybe that's what the Erie Canal represents best. Not just human achievement, but human evolution, the understanding that greatness isn't in how far or fast we move, but in how deeply we remember. As darkness returns, the canal once again becomes a mirror. The stars tremble in its reflection, the wind settles, and for a brief moment, the boundary between past and present vanishes completely. You can almost feel the pulse of 2 centuries overlapping, the sound of an old boat rope tightening, the murmur of an engine, the laughter of strangers, the sigh of a night breeze. Everything is still here, flowing quietly beneath the same sky. The Erie Canal endures not just in geography, but in consciousness. It's become something far larger than its own length, a living meditation, a proof that stillness can carry more meaning than motion. When dawn comes again, the light touches the water like forgiveness. The ripples spread outward, soft and endless. Somewhere, far away, the Hudson waits, patient as always, and somewhere beyond that, the Atlantic. But the canal never hurries toward them. It knows that the journey itself is the purpose, and so it flows, slow, patient, eternal, reminding anyone who listens that time isn't something to conquer, but something to accompany. Morning light spills across the canal like liquid gold. It's quiet again, not the silence of absence, but of presence. A deep, patient kind of quiet that holds everything it has ever heard. Footsteps, laughter, oars slicing water, the breath of wind through pine. The canal does not need to remind anyone of what it was. It simply exists, alive in its stillness, complete in its persistence. Birds circle above the glistening surface, their reflections bending gently with each ripple. Along the towpath, a man jogs past with his dog, the rhythm of their steps soft and steady. A few early cyclists whisper through the morning air, and in a nearby lock, water rises slowly behind an old wooden gate. The creak of metal is not harsh anymore. It sounds like an old friend clearing its throat after a long, peaceful sleep. Somewhere beyond the next bend, a small canal boat moves forward, leaving behind a delicate wake. Inside, a family stands on deck. A father steering, two children leaning over the rail, watching the water twist in miniature whirlpools. They don't know it, but they're tracing the same path that millions of others once traveled for survival, for hope, for something better. Now they travel for the same reason, only quieter. The Erie Canal has become more than history now. It's a pulse beneath the land, a heartbeat still echoing through time. As the sun climbs higher, the air grows warm. The smell of earth rises, damp, rich, alive. Trees on either side of the canal sway gently, their leaves reflecting silver-green light onto the surface. The reflections shimmer like memories, overlapping past and present until they're indistinguishable. If you stand here long enough, you begin to feel the layers of time moving beneath the still water. You realize that the canal isn't frozen in history. It's still flowing through every life that pauses beside it. A fisherman nearby lowers his line slowly into the water. He's been coming here since his 20s. Now his hair is gray, his hands calloused but gentle. He never catches much, and he doesn't need to. He says the canal listens to him, and that's enough. He tells stories to anyone who will sit beside him. About the barges that once passed every few minutes. About the workers who sang to keep rhythm while hauling ropes. About the summer he met his wife right here by the lock. Every story ends the same way, with a small smile, a glance at the water, and the quiet line, "It's still here, you know. Still alive." And he's right, the canal breathes. Through fog, through frost, through the long green summers. Through the hum of modern life that barely touches it. It remains steady, as if it has learned something the rest of the world has forgotten. How to endure without needing to change. No monument of stone or steel could have lasted this gracefully. The canal's endurance is not in its strength, but in its softness. In the way it bends, flows, adapts, and accepts. Every drop of its water carries a story, yet none of them scream to be heard. They whisper endlessly in harmony. At noon, sunlight dances on the ripples, scattering light across the bridge rails. Children wave from above as a narrowboat passes under them. A group of kayakers paddle slowly, their laughter rising and falling with each stroke. From a distance, it all looks timeless, silhouettes against a curtain of light. This is what the canal has become now, a place where life moves at the pace of memory. In an age of constant motion, the Erie Canal stands as a reminder that not all movement needs to be fast, not all progress needs to be loud. Sometimes the truest motion is simply the act of flowing, quietly, steadily, with purpose but without rush. Later in the afternoon, clouds begin to gather. Their shadows slide across the water, soft and shifting. The canal darkens to a deep reflective green. A storm threatens somewhere far away. But here the air remains calm, heavy, thoughtful. You can feel the weight of centuries pressing softly against your skin, as though the very atmosphere carries memory. Every gust of wind feels familiar, like an echo returning home. And in that feeling lies the canal's greatest truth, that history doesn't live in museums or monuments. It lives in the spaces between things, in water that still flows, in air that still carries the scent of wet stone, in the rhythm of footsteps along a towpath where time forgot to hurry. Evening comes quietly. The world slows again. Along the banks, lanterns flicker to life in distant homes. Their reflections stretch across the canal like strings of gold. Fireflies rise, their light blending with the stars that begin to appear one by one. A sense of endless continuity fills the scene, as if the canal is breathing the night into being. Somewhere near Lock 19, an old clock tower chimes softly. Each note drifts across the water, dissolving into the dark. It's impossible to tell whether it's 1825 or 2025. The sound feels outside of time, suspended between memory and now. And then, almost imperceptibly, rain begins to fall, gentle at first. Small ripples, each one a perfect circle, then steadier. The surface trembles but doesn't break. The canal receives the rain the way it receives everything, quietly, completely without resistance. Every drop becomes part of it, just as every story, every life, every dream once did. The rain thickens, whispering softly against the leaves. The smell of wet earth fills the air. Somewhere thunder rolls, distant but kind. The canal darkens under the storm, yet somehow glows within it. a mirror to the sky's grief and its beauty. You stand there, watching the water blur under the rain, and you realize something simple but profound, that the Erie Canal is not just a story about what people built. It's a story about what they became after building it. Every hand that dug its path, every heart that dreamed of its completion, every soul that stood beside it, they all learned something the canal itself teaches endlessly. That purpose does not end when usefulness fades. Meaning survives in memory, in care, in continuity. As the rain slows, the world softens again. Drops cling to leaves and iron rails, glistening in the faint light of dusk. Mist rises from the surface, curling into the trees. The storm passes, leaving behind silence deep enough to hear the canal breathing once more. Now the water is calm again, not because it never moved, but because it has learned how to rest. In the distance, a faint glow appears, the light of a boat lantern swaying gently as it drifts down the canal. The family from the morning is still aboard. The children are asleep now, their heads resting on folded arms, while their parents sit quietly at the bow, watching the last colors fade from the horizon. The father whispers something, too soft to hear, and the mother smiles. They don't speak after that. They just drift, slowly, following the curve of the water into the gathering dark. Above them, the first stars appear. Their reflections flicker in the ripples, as if the heavens themselves are leaning closer to listen. And there, between water and sky, the Erie Canal continues, not as a monument, not as a relic, but as a living echo of what humans once dared to imagine and what they still quietly cherish. The simple beauty of connection. Connection between past and present, between ambition and peace, between effort and rest, between what we build and what we become. The canal carries all of it, endlessly, patiently, beautifully. Somewhere far to the east, the Hudson still waits, its wide mouth open to the sea. To the west, Lake Erie lies vast and still, remembering the day the first lock opened. And between them stretches this quiet ribbon of endurance, a river of memory flowing through the spine of a restless land. If you listen, truly listen, you can hear its voice, not loud, not grand, but infinitely steady. It says, everything flows, everything endures, nothing is lost, and then slowly, the night swallows the last traces of light. The water darkens to glass. The reflections vanish into themselves. The canal sleeps, not ending, not beginning, just continuing, as it always has, as it always will. Somewhere, a single drop falls from a leaf and joins the surface. One sound, one circle, spreading softly outward into eternity. The Erie Canal, the water that remembers, keeps flowing through the quiet heart of a nation that has long forgotten how to be still, but still somehow finds its reflection here. It does not speak, it does not need to. Its silence says everything. And in that silence, history becomes eternal.